my vocation story to the priesthood really began before I was born, because as many of you might be aware, my father was murdered when my mother was 6 months pregnant with me. And that obviously was a great tragedy for my mother and in our family life, but I was pretty immune to it. I was in my mother's womb. I didn't know what was going on. Um, but my mom, um, Louise Naumann, was a great woman of faith. And she obviously was very hurt by this tragedy in her life. It totally changed the trajectory of what she thought her marriage and family life was going to be. But as I got to be a teenager, I would talk to family and friends and ask them, friends of my parents, what that was like at that time. And they would tell me that, your mother really grieved the death of your father. They had a beautiful relationship and great love. But she wasn't overcome with despair at that point. She still had hope about her. She still was interested in other people around her. As she drew closer to the Lord, I think, at that time. And while she didn't believe that God desired my father to die the way that he did, that was a result of sin. But she believed that God was faithful to his promise and that he would be with her and with our family, and he could bring even good out of this evil. And because of that, I think the priest in the parish where I grew up in South St. Louis, St. Thomas of Aquin Parish, they took a special interest in our family and my brother and I. And priests were always close to our family. They were always great friends of our family. And so I think that's part of what got me thinking about the possibility of a vocation to the priesthood. My mother also liked to share stories with my brother and I about my father. She wanted us to know about him. And one of the things that he was very passionate about was baseball. And he went from high school right into the minor leagues. One of the stories she told us about him was that when he was a senior in high school, he was in a public high school in St. Louis at the time. And even in the public high schools then, you took Latin. And his senior year, the Cardinals were in the World Series, was one of their great teams, the Gas House Gang. They called him at that time. His Latin teacher said, if anybody skips to go to the World Series, I'm going to flunk you, no matter what else you do the rest of the year. So my dad really didn't believe that she would do that. He went to the World Series, and she was faithful to her promise. So he had to do an extra semester of Latin. But that just illustrated how important baseball was for him. He went into the Cardinals minor league system. Branch Rickey was the general manager of the Cardinals at that time. And he played on a number of teams in Texas and Florida. He was a catcher, and he caught Stan Musial when Musial was a pitcher before they figured out he was a much better hitter than he was a pitcher. The Second World War interrupted his baseball aspirations. He was drafted early in the war. My mother and my father got married shortly after he was actually drafted. My mother at the time was only 18 years old. And I remember her telling me that she told my grandfather that she was 18, practically 19, almost 20, and to convince him that this was a prudent thing. And so they got married. She followed him out to the West Coast in Oregon, where he was doing his basic training. The beginning of her marriage was really framed by the Second World War. She prayed, and my grandparents on both sides prayed for my father to return from the war, which he did, although many of those that he fought with, many of his compatriots didn't make it home. And once he got back, he didn't continue his baseball career. He began to work, and fortunately, he continued to play amateur baseball. And in 1997, almost 50 years after his death, he was inducted into the St. Louis Amateur Baseball Hall of Fame, which was it was beautiful that they remembered him all those years later. I always say I think it's good that my father never got to see me play baseball, but my mother made sure we were baseball fans, and that's always continued to be a great pastime for me. I love to follow baseball, both the Cardinals and the Royals.